Hi, I'm Emily. I'll be your storyteller today. Many of you use these stories to fall asleep. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Also, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now get comfortable. Close your eyes and let the sound of the rain guide you into the story. The road twisted endlessly between cliffs and crashing waves as I drove into the village of Marrow's End. The rain hadn't stopped since I left the highway hours ago, and now the narrow coastal path seemed to dissolve beneath the tires. My grandmother's house came into view, just as a low rumble of thunder rolled over the ocean. I cut the engine and listened. No birds, no wind, just the sound of rain hitting the windshield like a quiet warning. The house stood at the edge of the cliff, gray and skeletal against the fading sky. I had been here only once as a child, too long ago to remember the details. Yet something about the salt in the air, the warped porch boards, the lopsided mailbox, all felt faintly familiar. I opened the door with a rusty key left under a loose stone, and the smell hit me immediately. Old wood, mildew, and something sour underneath. The kind of scent that clings to silence and secrets. Inside, the shadows stretched unnaturally across the hallway, as if the house hadn't welcomed a soul in years. I flipped the light switch by the door. Nothing. Power lines probably down, I thought, trying not to feel the knot tightening in my chest. I lit a small candle from my bag and moved through the foyer, dust dancing in the soft flame like spirits. Disturbed. My footsteps echoed too loudly on the floorboards, and I caught myself whispering an apology to the dark. I dropped my bag in the front room and turned toward the large bay window overlooking the sea. It was nearly night. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the coastline for a single breathless second. That's when I saw it. Out on the tip of the rocks, the lighthouse stood. Tall, silent, but unmistakably glowing. I blinked, stepped closer, but the light vanished just as fast as it had appeared. Everyone said it had been deactivated years ago. I told myself it was just heat lightning or a trick of the storm. Maybe it was nothing. But the longer I stared out into the rain, the more certain I became. The lighthouse had been watching, waiting, and somehow, it knew I had returned. A cold shiver ran down my back as the first whisper of doubt settled into my mind, one that would only grow louder with every storm that followed. That night, I couldn't sleep. The mattress in the guest room sagged in the middle, and the blanket smelled faintly of mothballs and sea salt. Outside, the storm thickened, the wind rising in long, sweeping moans that pressed against the window panes like something trying to get in. I stared at the ceiling in the candlelight, eyes tracing the cracks that resembled veins branching from the corners. Every creak of the old house made my heart flutter. Somewhere around midnight, the rain began to change. It came down harder, sharper, as if the sky itself were angry. I sat up, suddenly aware of the deep silence beneath the storm. No cars, no barking dogs, no movement at all. I got up and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peer outside. The sea was invisible, swallowed by darkness. But out on the rocks, the lighthouse gleamed again. Not a flicker this time. Steady. White. Watching. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and stepped into the hallway. The wooden floor groaned under my weight. I hadn't planned to go outside, but something pulled at me. I told myself it was curiosity, but there was a heaviness in my chest that I couldn't explain. At the end of the hall, I passed the door to my grandmother's bedroom. It was closed. I paused, my fingers brushing the doorknob, but a sudden chill made me pull away. Instead, I went to the living room, hoping the light had faded, and I could convince myself it was all in my head. But when I opened the front door, the cold night hit me like a slap. Rain lashed sideways across the porch, and thunder cracked above like the sky splitting open. And still, there it was, the lighthouse beam slicing through the storm, sweeping across the cliffs. It passed over the house, over me, then vanished again into blackness. I backed inside and shut the door hard, bolting it without realizing. My hands trembled. I told myself it didn't matter. Old buildings have glitches. Maybe someone had restored it without telling the town. But that didn't explain why the villagers said it hadn't worked in years. That didn't explain why I felt, just for a second, like that beam wasn't lighting the way, but searching. The morning came without warning. I must have drifted off, in the armchair, because the candle had melted to a stump and my neck ached from the awkward angle. Outside, the storm had passed, but a heavy mist lingered along the ground, coiling around the fence posts like smoke. I brewed some instant coffee in the ancient kettle and stood barefoot by the window. The lighthouse was no longer visible through the haze, but the sensation it left behind hadn't lifted. Later that day, I walked through the village. Cobblestone streets still glistened with rain, and the salty air stuck to my skin. The people I passed gave polite nods, but their eyes slid past me too quickly, like they were trying not to see something. I stopped at the small grocery store to ask about the weather and mentioned the lighthouse in passing. The clerk, a man with silver hair and a distant expression, froze for a heartbeat before bagging my things without another word. I wandered further, letting my feet take me down paths I half remembered from childhood. The village hadn't changed much. Same faded signs, same quiet streets, same worn benches looking out over the cliffs. I reached the edge of town where a rusted sign pointed toward Whale's Watch. That's what they called the cliff trail near the lighthouse. I paused, but something in the back of my mind warned me not to follow it. Not yet. That night, the power returned briefly. Just enough to hear the hum of the refrigerator kick in, and the overhead lights flicker once before going dark again. I sat on the living room floor with a blanket around my shoulders, listening to the distant crash of waves. Then came the sound again, a deep mechanical groan that made the walls tremble faintly. The sound of something ancient turning like a gear in a forgotten machine. The lighthouse light passed once across the windows. I didn't move. I just sat there, breathing shallow, as the light returned and swept the room again, then stopped, frozen in place. A beam of white fell directly across the living room floor like a spotlight. It didn't move again. I reached for my flashlight, but its battery had died. The only thing I could do was wait, and as I did, I could have sworn, somewhere beyond the storm, I heard the sound of footsteps in shallow water, slowly getting closer. The beam eventually vanished, as suddenly as it had come. The room fell back into darkness, but I no longer felt alone in it. I sat in silence for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to speak. My mind raced to make sense of what had happened. Had someone reactivated the lighthouse? Why didn't anyone in town mention it? And why did I feel, deep in my bones, that it had seen me? Sleep that night was impossible. I lay curled beneath the covers, every creak and shift of the house magnified in the silence. At some point, I heard the low moan of the foghorn in the distance, though I hadn't known it still functioned. Its tone was slow and hollow, like a call from something submerged too long beneath the surface. I clutched my pillow tighter and waited for the dawn. When morning came, I checked the front door. Damp footprints stretched across the porch, not mine. The floorboards near the threshold were warped and slightly darker, as if someone had stood there for a long time in soaked boots. No signs of forced entry. Nothing missing. Just the undeniable proof that I had not been imagining the sounds from the night before. Someone, or something, had come to the house while I sat in the dark. I thought about calling someone, maybe the local police. But what would I say? That a forgotten lighthouse turned its light toward me, and someone walked up to my house in the rain just to watch? Even I couldn't explain it aloud without sounding unstable. Instead, I spent the rest of the day checking locks, drawing curtains, and telling myself I had time to figure this out. But I already knew better. The lighthouse would light again, and next time, I feared it wouldn't stop at the windows. That night, as the sky began to darken once more, and the familiar smell of ozone returned to the wind, I stood at the window and watched the coastline. I told myself I would not be afraid, that I would face whatever came with reason, not fear. But when the first flash of white lit up the sky and the lighthouse blinked awake again, without thunder, without rain, I understood something deeper than fear. I hadn't come back to this village by accident. It had called me. The next morning, the clouds hung low over Marrow's End, casting everything in a dull gray that made the ocean and sky indistinguishable. I walked into town again, drawn by the need to speak to someone, anyone, about the light. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional fisherman returning early, or a child darting past with rain boots and no destination. I found myself standing in front of the village inn, an old brick building with a sagging porch and a crooked sign that read, "The Gull's Nest." Inside, the air was warm and thick with the scent of baked bread and wood smoke. A woman stood behind the front desk, her hair a silver coil pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. She looked up and smiled. Pleasant, but not warm. Her eyes, sharp and gray, lingered on me a second longer than they should have. "You're the girl from the Cliff House," she said before I could speak. "I remember your grandmother well." Her voice was calm, but her gaze flicked toward the window as if checking to see who might be listening. I introduced myself, unsure what to say next. She nodded, then offered me a cup of tea without asking if I wanted one. We sat in the dining room, a cozy space with crooked chairs and a fire that crackled softly. The silence stretched thin between us until I finally asked, as gently as I could, "Has anyone seen the lighthouse working recently?" Her smile didn't fade, but her fingers tightened around her teacup. "That old thing?" she replied. "No, it's been dark for years." She took a sip. "Mostly." I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "I saw the light. Twice. At night. And I think someone came to the house." She set her cup down slowly, deliberately. "Some lights aren't meant to guide," she said. "Some are meant to warn. And some, well, some are only lit when something wants to be seen." Her tone was even, but there was a subtle change in her expression, like she'd said too much. "You should stay indoors after dark. she added, almost as an afterthought. I wanted to ask more, to press her for details, but she stood before I could speak. People come to Marrow's End to forget, she said, smoothing her apron. Not to remember, and you'd do well not to go looking for things that left themselves behind. Her words were gentle but final. I thanked her and stepped out into the fog, my heart heavier than before. The door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded, somehow, like a lock. As I walked back through the village, I noticed something strange. People seemed to vanish as I passed. A man sweeping his porch stopped mid-motion and slipped inside. 2 women talking by the bakery grew silent and turned away. It wasn't overt hostility, but something quieter, colder. They weren't just avoiding conversation. They were avoiding me. I told myself it was my imagination, that small towns could be insular. But deep down, I knew they knew something I didn't. Back at the house, the mist had thickened, turning the cliffside into a curtain of white. I stood at the edge of the yard, peering out over the sea. Somewhere beyond that fog lay the lighthouse, invisible now, but not gone. I wondered who maintained it, who lit the beam. If it truly hadn't functioned for years, then what had I seen? The wind picked up, rattling the loose shutters like fingers drumming on wood. I went back inside and locked the door behind me. That evening, I tried to distract myself with books from the old shelf, but the words refused to settle. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see that beam again. When the rain started, light at first, it brought a strange comfort, until I realized the house had grown colder despite the closed windows. I added a log to the fireplace and lit it, watching the flames dance in quiet defiance of the storm gathering outside. A loud clack interrupted the silence. I froze. It had come from the back of the house, maybe the mudroom or the kitchen. Stood slowly, heart thudding, and crept toward the sound with the fire poker in hand. The back door was shut, locked, but the window above the sink had fogged over from the inside, as if someone had stood there breathing against it. I wiped it with my sleeve. Nothing outside but the dark yard and swaying grass. I returned to the living room, but the calm had evaporated. The shadows felt longer now, more defined. I drew the curtains, shut off the lights, and curled up in the armchair again. My thoughts kept circling back to the innkeeper's words. Some lights are meant to warn. She knew something. They all did. And I had the unsettling feeling that I wasn't just being watched by people. I was being watched by the place itself. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of dripping, sharp and irregular, echoing through the house like a metronome. For dread, I thought at first it was the sink, maybe the faucet left loose. But when I followed the noise, it led me to the front hallway. There, beneath the window, was a small puddle. The glass above it was closed, and the curtains were drawn, but the puddle grew wider with each drop. When I looked up, I saw something that made me stop breathing, a single wet footprint on the wall, as if someone had walked up it and vanished into the ceiling. I stumbled back, nearly slipping, and ran to the kitchen for a towel. I wiped the water away, all the while glancing behind me. The house groaned in the wind, its old bones shifting. I wanted to tell myself it was just a leak, just moisture and mold. But the print had been detailed. 5 distinct toes, the arch, the curve of a heel, and I could still feel the pressure in the air. That same tight silence I'd felt when the lighthouse beam had frozen on my window. I didn't sleep after that. I sat with my back to the wall, watching the hallway, the towel still clutched in my hands. The storm rolled in slowly, lightning flickering like a dying heartbeat behind the clouds. I waited for the light, dreading it, needing it. Around 2 a.m, it came, slicing through the mist, through the rain, and painting the windows in pale white. It didn't sweep this time. It hovered, held, and then blinked out like an eye closing. The foghorn followed a moment later, low and long, vibrating through the floorboards. I felt it in my chest. It was a summons, not a warning, not a guide, a call. And whoever, whatever, was being called. I feared it wasn't me. I sat in the dark and whispered the name of the innkeeper, just to hear a human word again. Mrs. Ellery. That's what the nameplate had said. I whispered it over and over until it lost meaning. Then I heard something impossible. My name. Spoken clearly from outside the window. Not shouted, not whispered, just said, as if someone were standing right there, just beyond the curtain. I didn't move. I didn't look. I just closed my eyes and waited for morning, knowing that sleep wouldn't come, knowing that someone out there knew I was here, knew my name, and was waiting for me to step outside. Morning came gray and hollow. I hadn't moved from the floor, my back sore, my eyes burning from lack of sleep. I finally stood, forcing myself to act normal, make tea, clean the dishes, wipe down the windows. But no amount of routine could erase the memory of that voice. It hadn't sounded angry or mournful. It had sounded patient, like someone who had waited a long time and would continue waiting. I didn't open the curtains. I didn't want to see if the footprints had returned. I made my way back to the inn that afternoon, telling myself I'd invent a reason, ask about local history, or find an excuse to stay a while. But the moment I stepped inside, Mrs. Ellery looked up as if she'd been expecting me. "You heard it, didn't you?" she asked softly. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. She gestured for me to sit again, and this time, she poured the tea without a word. It tasted different, stronger, earthier. "You should be careful," she said. "Curiosity has its cost here." I asked her what the lighthouse was, who maintained it, why no one seemed to want to speak about it. She shook her head slowly. "That light hasn't belonged to anyone for a long time," she said. "Not since before I was born. Maybe not ever." She stared at her hands. "But it wakes up when it feels something it remembers. A name, a sound, a bloodline. You carry all three." Her words landed like stones in my stomach. My grandmother had lived here her whole life. What had she left behind? As I left the inn, I felt the shift again in the villagers' eyes. This time it wasn't avoidance. It was knowing. They looked at me like someone already gone. A shadow of myself moving among them. The fog was rolling in faster than before, curling through the alleys and drifting down from the cliffs. I didn't walk home. I ran, slipping on the slick stones, hearing the echo of my name once again, fainter, but still clear. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. That night, I stood at the window again, arms wrapped tightly around myself. No rain, no thunder. But the air felt wet, charged, humming with invisible energy. I didn't have to wait long. The beam of the lighthouse blinked to life with no warning. Bright, focused, unwavering. This time it didn't scan the coast. It aimed straight at the village, straight at my window. I didn't move. I just watched it. And for a moment, in the center of that blinding light, I thought I saw a figure standing inside the glass room at the top, watching me back. The attic door groaned as I pulled it open, releasing a wave of dust and cold air that smelled faintly of mothballs, wood, and something older, like dried herbs left to rot. A narrow ladder unfolded from the ceiling, its wooden rungs slick under my fingers. I climbed slowly, flashlight in hand, every step creaking like a whispered warning. The house below faded into silence as I rose into the narrow crawl space above. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing boxes, broken furniture, and cobwebs thick enough to be mistaken for cloth. The air up there felt different, heavier, as though time had collected like soot in every corner. I stepped, carefully, the old floor groaning beneath my weight. Most of the boxes were sealed tight or had labels faded beyond reading. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe nothing at all. But the pull to explore was stronger than fear. Then, I saw it. A worn trunk pushed into the far corner, half covered by a moth-eaten quilt. Its brass clasp was rusted, but not locked. Inside were old family photographs, postcards from coastal towns, and a few yellowed envelopes bound in twine. Beneath these was a cloth-wrapped bundle. I unrolled it slowly, revealing a cracked leather notebook tied with a red ribbon. My name was written on the first page in delicate cursive. Not mine, but my grandmother's. Beneath it, a date, 30 years ago. I hesitated before turning the page, the air thick around me, as if the attic itself were holding its breath. The journal was part diary, part observation log. The first entries were mundane: weather, errands, herbal recipes. But the tone shifted after a few pages. Mentions of dreams, of hearing voices in the wind, of waking with salt on her skin. She wrote of the lighthouse light appearing during nights with no rain, and of footsteps echoing above her bedroom. "It knows when I'm awake," she wrote. "It waits for storms, but sometimes it comes early, just to be sure I haven't forgotten it." I flipped ahead, the writing growing more frantic, the ink darker, smeared in places. One page was filled with only a single line, repeated over and over in crooked handwriting. "Don't look at the light when it stops." I closed the book slowly, every hair on my arm standing upright. The attic creaked behind me, subtle but distinct. I wasn't alone up there. I turned off the flashlight, held my breath, and waited for the silence to return. The silence lasted for nearly a minute, dense and pressing. Then, from somewhere to my left, a soft tap, like fingers on old wood. I spun, heart hammering, flashlight flickering wildly as I scanned the shadows. Nothing moved, but the air shifted. It was subtle, like a held breath released too close to my ear. I backed toward the ladder, notebook pressed to my chest. As I descended, I could still hear it. Not footsteps, not breathing. Just presence, thick, waiting. Back on the ground floor, I locked the attic door and shoved a chair beneath it. A childish gesture, maybe, but it helped settle my nerves. I placed the notebook on the kitchen table and made tea with shaking hands. The steam fogged my glasses, and I welcomed the brief blindness. It gave me a moment to pretend this was just an old house, just an old book, and not the beginning of something unraveling inside the walls and inside me. I read more. Her entries became fragmented. Some were just single sentences. The sea was wrong today. He was standing in the field again. The mirror knows. Others described dreams where she stood inside the lighthouse, surrounded by light so bright it burned shadows onto the floor. She always woke with a bitter taste in her mouth and seaweed tangled in her bed sheets. There were no explanations, only breadcrumbs, and I was following them deeper into something I didn't understand. One passage stuck with me. He doesn't knock, he drips. She had underlined that twice. Another said, storms wake him, but names call him closer. I stopped saying mine out loud. I remembered the night before, when I'd whispered my own name into the dark. Had something heard me? Something more than wind and waves? I stared at the walls as if expecting them to answer. They didn't, but they listened. I could feel that much. I fell asleep on the couch, the journal open beside me. I dreamed of the attic. Not mine, but the same shape. I was standing at the window of a lighthouse, and below me, waves churned with something black and moving just beneath the surface. Behind me, footsteps echoed on the spiral stairs, getting closer with each flash of light. I turned to look, and the dream shattered. But I woke with salt on my lips, and my clothes damp as if from sea spray. The dream clung to me well into the morning, thick as fog. I showered, scrubbing at my skin as if to wash away something unseen. But I could still smell the ocean, even after the steam faded. I tossed my damp clothes into the laundry basket and stopped when something slid from the pocket. A tiny seashell, white and ridged, no larger than my fingertip. I hadn't picked it up. I hadn't been to the shore. My stomach turned. I tried to call someone, anyone, but my phone had no signal again. Not just weak, but nothing. I walked outside, holding it up toward the sky, toward the sea. Still nothing. The fog clung to the village like a veil. I saw no one on the street, not a soul. Even the gulls had gone quiet. I went back inside, heart drumming harder with each creak of the floorboards. The house felt stretched, like something too long asleep had begun to shift beneath it. That evening, I sat by the window with the journal in my lap, rereading every mention of the lighthouse. My grandmother had never written about going there, but she always described it as near the edge of thought, near the edge of waking. It follows the storms, but it doesn't chase them. It waits. That's worse. I looked out at the sky, clouds building, the wind picking up. The storm would come again tonight. I knew it. As the first drops hit the roof, I lit candles around the house. I didn't want to be caught in the dark again. The wind rattled the windows, and the shadows in the corners shifted just slightly, only enough to make me look twice. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the attic door. I didn't want to open it again, but I couldn't stop thinking about what else might be up there, what else she had hidden, or what had never left. A loud thud echoed from above, not soft, not distant. A single deliberate stomp, like a footfall just beyond the attic door. I stood frozen, breath caught in my throat, eyes fixed on the ceiling. The wind howled outside, and somewhere far off, the foghorn called once more. Then silence, no creak of boards, no footsteps retreating, just the house waiting, like it always had, quiet and full of things that never should have been remembered. I waited nearly an hour before climbing the attic stairs again. Every creak echoed in the bones of the house, like a voice warning me to stop. But I didn't stop. I needed answers, and whatever had stomped overhead wasn't going to leave quietly. I reached the top and opened the hatch slowly, letting the candlelight spill into the darkness. This time the air felt warmer, as if something had recently stirred the stillness. I moved carefully past the boxes to the trunk again. This time, I noticed a false bottom beneath the layer of photographs. I pried it open and found a second bundle wrapped in oilskin. Inside were more pages, loose, brittle with age, filled with sketches and strange symbols. The drawings weren't hers. The handwriting was different, sharper. Some pages showed figures standing at the top of the lighthouse. Others depicted spirals, storm clouds, and shapes rising from the sea. Among the pages was a letter addressed to my grandmother, dated the year before she died. It wasn't signed, just a scrawled warning. You stopped calling it, but the name is still in you. You passed it down. When the fog lifts, it will remember. I read the sentence over and over, feeling the cold grip of recognition. I wasn't just drawn here by inheritance. I had been brought, or offered. Something ancient had remembered me. A loud click rang out behind me. I turned fast, nearly dropping the candle. The attic door had shut on its own. I rushed to it, heart pounding, and yanked it open. Nothing stood on the other side, but the hallway below was pitch black. I climbed down fast, every instinct screaming. At the base of the ladder, the journal lay open on the floor, pages fluttering as if someone had just flipped through them. But I hadn't left it there. I picked it up, and something new had been written on the final page. The ink was still wet, glistening in the candlelight. A sentence in my grandmother's handwriting. Don't let it call your name 3 times. I ran to the window. The storm had fully arrived. The wind screamed, the waves crashed, and the lighthouse beam had returned. It swept past the house once, then again, and as it passed a third time, the candle in my hand flickered, and a voice from somewhere far too close whispered my name, twice. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the sky bruised and the sea gray as ash. I hadn't slept. I couldn't. The voice had whispered my name twice, and I'd spent the rest of the night staring at the door, waiting for the third. But it never came. I took that as a warning, not a mercy. That morning, I walked toward the harbor, needing space, air, distraction, anything to stop my thoughts from looping back to the attic, to the journal, to the lighthouse beam cutting across my walls. The dock was mostly empty, the boats rocking gently in their slips. A thin mist hovered above the water, making the world feel unreal, like a dream I hadn't quite woken from. A man stood alone near the end of the dock, mending a tangled net. His hands were rough, knuckles cracked, and his coat was old but clean. He looked up as I approached, and his eyes narrowed. Not unkind, but wary, like someone who'd seen too much to trust easily. "Morning," I said, my voice unsure even to me. He nodded, said nothing. I hesitated, then pointed out toward the rocks. "That lighthouse, is it ever used?" He didn't look. He didn't need to. "Not by anyone who wants to come back," he replied, his voice low and rasped by sea air. I waited for him to elaborate. He simply returned to his net, as if the conversation was already over. still, something in his posture softened. "I'm staying at my grandmother's house," I offered. "Up on the cliff. I paused. "She used to write about the light." He looked at me then, really looked. "Then you should know better than to follow it." He set the net aside and gestured toward a small boat tied nearby. "Sometimes it's better to look at things from the water. You see what land hides." It wasn't a question, but an invitation. I didn't ask his name. He didn't ask mine. We climbed into the boat in silence, and he rowed with quiet strength, the oars cutting clean through the water. As we moved away from the shore, the village faded behind us, swallowed by fog and distance. Ahead, the sea stretched wide and empty, but my eyes were drawn to the jagged rocks near the base of the lighthouse. I could have sworn something was moving there. Not a boat, not a bird. Something darker, slower, like a shadow with weight. The boat rocked gently beneath us, each wave lifting and lowering us like a breath too deep to belong to anything human. The closer we drew to the lighthouse, the more distorted the air seemed, wavy, thick, as if heat shimmered from the cold rocks. The boatman's eyes stayed fixed ahead, never once glancing toward the light tower. "You know what lives in the sea?" he asked suddenly. I shook my head. "Memory," he said. "And it never forgets who's left something behind." We floated in silence for a while. Then he pointed toward a jagged outcrop just beneath the lighthouse foundation. "There used to be a path down to the rocks," he said. "The villagers sealed it decades ago. Said it was too dangerous. But people kept going anyway. They always do." I asked what they were looking for. He didn't answer. Just turned the boat slightly to the right, putting the lighthouse out of view. I felt an immediate relief in my chest. I hadn't realized how tense I'd become. "There's something under the lighthouse," he said after a while. "A hollow. You can feel it if you get close enough. Some say it used to be a cave. Others say it's older than that. Older than this place. The lighthouse was built on top of it, like a lid on a jar. But lids come loose." He didn't smile. I looked down into the water. It was black, not dark. Black. As if the sea itself refused to reflect the sky when near that place. "I saw footprints," I said softly. "Wet ones. Inside the house." He nodded as if that confirmed something he already suspected. "It walks now," he said. "It didn't used to. But the storms open things." He looked at me then, and his expression held no surprise, only sadness. "And you're from her blood. That house's bones know you. That name of yours, it'll echo longer than hers did." We turned back toward the village, the boat gliding through the mist like a thought unspoken. As the lighthouse slipped from view, I felt the shift again, like something releasing its grip on my shoulders. But in its place came a quiet certainty. I had been seen. Not by the boatman, not by the villagers, but by something older. Something watching from behind the lens of the lighthouse. And now that it had noticed me, it would not look away. Back on shore, I thanked him quietly. He didn't respond, only gave a slight nod and turned back to his net, as if the conversation had ended the moment the boat touched the dock. I walked away slowly, but I could feel his gaze on my back until I turned the first corner. Whether it was concern or warning, I couldn't tell. The village looked the same, but something about it felt dimmer, more withdrawn, like it was waiting for something I couldn't see yet. At home, I left my coat by the door and stood in the foyer, water dripping from the hem of my sleeves. The house was colder than it had been that morning. The fire had gone. Out. The curtains moved slightly, even though the windows were closed. I stepped into the living room and froze. On the coffee table, the journal had been opened. Not by me. The page was different now, one I hadn't reached yet. It read, "The Boatman took me once too. He never told me what it cost." I backed away, heart pounding, and turned toward the hallway. That's when I noticed them. Wet footprints, starting at the back door and leading toward the staircase. They were bare, human-shaped, glistening slightly against the old wooden floor. My first instinct was to run, but my legs didn't move. I just stared. The prints stopped halfway down the hall, not leading into a room, not turning back. They simply stopped. As if the thing that made them had vanished, or worse, was still standing there. Invisible, I forced myself to follow the trail. I held my breath as I stepped forward, half expecting to walk into something solid that I couldn't see. But there was nothing, just the prints, still damp, still fresh. I checked the back door. It was bolted shut from the inside. I touched the lock. Cold. Too cold. I reached out to feel the wood of the frame and pulled my hand back instantly. Salt. It was coated in salt, as if it had been submerged in the sea. I spent the rest of the day with all the lights on, even as the gray sky outside turned gold and then black again. I didn't eat. I didn't read. I didn't move far from the fireplace. At some point, I realized I was holding the journal in my lap, though I didn't remember picking it up. The page had changed again. Just 3 words now. It knows you. I closed the book and set it aside. And still, I felt the lighthouse lights sweeping across the sea, not randomly, not in rhythm, but tracing a slow, deliberate arc toward my window. Just after midnight, I heard the sound again, dripping, soft and irregular. It came from near the front door this time. I walked slowly toward it, every step deliberate, candle in hand. There was no puddle this time, no footprints, just that faint, wet rhythm against the wood. I leaned close to the door, hesitating. On the other side, I could hear something breathing, slow, steady, like the tide drawing in. I didn't open it. I couldn't. I simply stood there, listening, until the sound faded into the wind. I returned to the living room and curled up on the floor beside the cold hearth. The candlelight flickered on the walls, casting long, trembling shapes that bent and twitched like they were alive. I told myself not to look at the windows. I told myself not to speak my name aloud. I repeated the boatman's words in my mind. Some things don't come to shore unless they're called. And I had called. Not with my voice, maybe, but by coming here. By remembering. Sleep finally found me, brittle and thin. I woke to the sound of something sliding softly across wood. Not footsteps, not wind. A scraping, like something being dragged, across the porch. I sat up, heart hammering, and waited. Silence. Then, slowly, I crept to the door. I didn't open it. I only looked through the peephole. The porch was empty, but something sat at the base of the door. A single object, carefully placed, waiting. At first, I didn't want to touch it. I stared at it for nearly an hour, debating whether to leave it there until morning. But something told me that morning wouldn't change what it was. I unlocked the door with trembling fingers, opened it just wide enough to reach through, and grabbed the item. A small tin box. Rusted, dented, but sealed tight. On the lid, etched faintly in crooked letters, was my name. I didn't open it. Not yet. I set it on the table, beside the journal, and stepped back. The box hummed softly, a vibration I could feel through the floorboards. And though the lighthouse hadn't lit that night, I felt its presence like a hand on the back of my neck. The boatman had shown me the sea's face, but now the sea had shown me mine, and whatever was inside that box, it hadn't been left. It had been delivered. The tin box sat unopened for hours. I circled it like an animal wary of a trap, drawn to it by equal parts fear and fascination. The humming had stopped sometime before dawn, but I still felt the vibration in the floor, in my teeth, in the base of my spine. I finally picked it up with both hands, half expecting heat or resistance, but the metal was cold. Too cold. I carried it to the mantel and placed it beneath the old mirror that hung above the fireplace. Then I waited, because I didn't know what else to do. The mirror had always unsettled me. Its glass held a faint greenish tint, and no matter how brightly the room was lit, the reflection always seemed dimmer than it should be. I remembered avoiding it as a child, and now I understood why. As I stared into it, I saw the room behind me. Bookshelf, windows, flickering candlelight. But something was off. A chair was pulled out that hadn't been touched. A shadow lingered near the hall that didn't belong to anything. I turned around fast. Nothing. I looked back. The chair was still pulled out. The shadow gone. I reached forward and touched the surface of the mirror. It was warm, warmer than the air around it. I stepped away, goosebumps rising along my arms, and glanced at the box again. It hadn't moved, hadn't opened, but it felt like it was waiting, like it knew something I didn't. And that, more than anything, made me afraid to touch it again. Later, the storm began without warning. No slow buildup, no distant thunder. Just a sudden downpour and wind that screamed against the windows like a living thing. I jumped at the sound, heart racing, and turned to see the mirror again. This time, my reflection wasn't alone. Behind me, just over my shoulder, stood a figure. Unmoving, black silhouette, no face, no eyes, just shape. I turned around so fast I stumbled over the rug, but the room was empty. Of course it was, but the mirror still showed the figure. It hadn't vanished. It hadn't shifted. It simply stood there, patiently, just behind me in the glass. I backed away slowly, never breaking eye contact, if it even had eyes. Then, after what felt like hours, it raised one arm, not waving, not reaching, just pointing toward the tin box. I couldn't move. The rain pounded against the house, and thunder rattled the window panes. But inside, everything was still, except for the figure in the mirror. Its arm remained raised, finger steady, like a compass locked on a single point. I tried to will it away, to blink it out of existence, but it didn't fade. It was real in the way that nightmares are real, not made of flesh, but of memory and fear. I took one shaky step forward, and the figure vanished. The box hadn't changed. No glow, no sound, no movement. But the feeling in the room had. It felt thinner somehow, like the walls weren't holding back the outside world anymore. I picked up the box and sat with it in my lap. My fingers hovered over the lid. Don't let it call your name 3 times. My grandmother's warning echoed in my mind, but this felt different. This wasn't a voice trying to summon me. This was an offering, a test. I opened the box slowly. Inside, there were 3 objects: a key, blackened with age, a strip of fabric, soaked through and stiff with salt, and a folded piece of paper, creased so many times it nearly fell apart in my hands. I unfolded it gently. The note was written, in the same sharp hand that had filled the hidden attic pages. It read, "He walks when the storm is strongest. He sees through glass. He remembers water." No name, no signature. Just the truth, scribbled like a prayer. The mirror pulsed. Not physically, but in my vision, as if the glass had rippled for just a moment. I looked up, and the reflection was wrong again. The room behind me was in ruins. Books scattered, walls stained with seaweed, the windows shattered and rain pouring through. But when I turned to look at the actual room, it was untouched, perfectly still. The reflection was showing something else. Not a memory, not quite a prophecy. A warning, maybe. Or a promise. I stared at myself in the glass. My face looked pale. Drawn, not entirely mine anymore. The storm outside howled louder, and lightning strobed through the room. With each flash, the reflection changed again. My figure replaced by others. My grandmother, the innkeeper, the boatman, and finally, the dark silhouette once more. It was closer now, no longer behind me. It stood in front of the mirror, staring back. And slowly, it raised its hand and touched the glass. I stumbled backward, knocking over the candle. The room plunged into a darkness broken only by the jagged flashes of lightning outside. I scrambled to relight the wick, my hands shaking so violently that I burned my thumb. When the flame finally rose again, the mirror was blank. Just glass. Just me. But the fear didn't leave. I could still feel the warmth of that figure's hand pressing through the reflection, as if it had left something behind on the surface. The air in the room felt wrong, too close, too damp. I turned my attention to the strip of fabric from the box. It was rough, stained with something that smelled faintly of brine and rust, blood and salt. I didn't recognize the material, but it felt like something torn from a ritual. Not cloth meant to warm, but to bind. I held it up to the light and noticed a faint symbol stitched near the edge. A spiral, surrounded by tiny dots, like a constellation. I'd seen it before, on one of the attic pages. My grandmother had drawn it, and now I knew it wasn't just a symbol. It was a mark. The key, black and corroded, was heavier than it looked. Cold to the touch. Not like iron or brass, but something older. Bone, maybe. I turned it over in my palm, trying to guess what it might open. It didn't belong to any door in this house. I would have known. And yet, I felt certain there was a lock somewhere waiting for it. Maybe something buried beneath the floorboards, or deeper, beneath the cliff, beneath the lighthouse, where the sea could no longer wash it away. I placed all 3 items back in the box and slid it beneath the couch. I wasn't ready for what they wanted to show me. Not yet. I needed air. I wrapped myself in my coat and stepped outside into the storm. The wind nearly knocked me over. Rain came sideways, sharp and cold as needles. I made my way to the edge of the cliff, where the grass bowed low and the earth softened beneath my feet. The lighthouse stood in the distance, dark and waiting. But I knew it wouldn't stay that way, and I was right. As lightning fractured the sky, the beam erupted from the top of the lighthouse, blinding, perfect, alive. It swept across the coast like an accusation, pausing only once, on me. I covered my eyes, but the light burned through my eyelids, branding its presence into my mind. And just as quickly as it came, it vanished again. The storm screamed around me, and I heard a sound I hadn't heard before, glass breaking from inside the house. I ran back inside, soaked and breathless, my boots tracking mud across the floor. The house was silent except for the wind howling through the broken window in the living room. Shards of glass glinted on the rug like scattered teeth. The mirror, it had shattered. I approached slowly, heart pounding, and saw that the break wasn't random. The cracks formed a spiral, just like the symbol on the fabric, perfectly etched, deliberate. In the center of the mirror, among the fractured pieces still clinging to the frame, one shard remained smooth, too smooth. I leaned, drawn to it, unable to stop myself. It no longer reflected the room. It showed something else. Dark water, churning, a rocky shore, and a single figure standing beneath the lighthouse, head tilted upward as if listening. As I watched, the figure turned toward me. It had no face, just blackness, and yet I knew it saw me. I felt it inside my chest, coiling tight around my lungs. Then it spoke. Not aloud, not in the room, but inside my mind. A voice like deep water pulling downward. The third name is yours. My hands flew to my ears, but it didn't help. The words echoed inside me, not around me. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair, and the shard dropped from the frame, landing at my feet. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. It still showed the image, still moved, even disconnected from the glass. A portal, open, watching. I grabbed a blanket and threw it over the mirror, heart racing, breath shallow. It didn't help. I could still feel it, that connection, that weight pressing from the other side. I paced the room like a trapped animal, trying to find a place where the air didn't buzz against my skin. Every wall felt too thin. Every shadow felt inhabited. I clutched the journal, hoping for some new guidance, but the pages remained blank, as if the book had given all it could. I was alone now. Whatever came next, I would face it without help. As the storm howled through the hollow bones of the house, and the lighthouse beam returned once more to scan the cliffs, I sat on the floor and whispered my name aloud. Twice. Not 3 times. Never 3. The mirror stayed covered. The shard stayed still. But the air had changed, and I knew, deep in the marrow of my bones, that something had crossed through. It was no longer just watching. It was already inside. I ran back inside, soaked and breathless, my boots tracking mud across the floor. The house was silent except for the wind howling through the broken window in the living room. Shards of glass glinted on the rug like scattered teeth. The mirror. It had shattered. I approached slowly, heart pounding, and saw that the break wasn't random. The cracks formed a spiral, just like the symbol on the fabric. Perfectly etched. Deliberate. In the center of the mirror, among the fractured pieces still clinging to the frame, one shard remained smooth. Too smooth. I leaned in, drawn to it, unable to stop myself. It no longer reflected the room. It showed something else. Dark water, churning. A rocky shore. And a single figure standing beneath the lighthouse, head tilted upward as if listening. As I watched, the figure turned toward me. It had no face, just blackness. And yet I knew it saw me. I felt it inside my chest, coiling tight around my lungs. Then it spoke. Not aloud, not in the room, but inside my mind. A voice like deep water pulling downward. The third name is yours. My hands flew to my ears, but it didn't help. The words echoed inside me, not around me. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair, and the shard dropped from the frame, landing at my feet. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. It still showed the image, still moved, even disconnected from the glass. A portal, open, watching. I grabbed a blanket and threw it over the mirror, heart racing, breath shallow. It didn't help. I could still feel it, that connection, that weight pressing from the other side. I paced the room like a trapped animal, trying to find a place where the air didn't buzz against my skin. Every wall felt too thin. Every shadow felt inhabited. I clutched the journal, hoping for some new guidance, but the pages remained blank, as if the book had given all it could. I was alone now. Whatever came next, I would face it without help. As the storm howled through the hollow bones of the house and the lighthouse beam returned once more to scan the cliffs, I sat on the floor and whispered my name aloud. Twice. Not 3 times. Never 3. The mirror stayed covered. The shard stayed still. But the air had changed. And I knew, deep in the marrow of my bones, that something had crossed through. It was no longer just watching. It was already inside. The path into the woods was overgrown, hidden behind thorny bushes and tangled vines, as if nature itself had tried to bury it. I followed the direction on the map, counting steps between landmarks. An old stone wall, a tree split by lightning, a broken fence post with rusted wire. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. My boots sank into wet leaves, and every snapped twig beneath my feet echoed louder than it should have. Eventually, the trail opened into a small clearing, oval-shaped, surrounded by twisted trees bent inward like watchers. The ground in the center had been disturbed. Not recently, but long enough ago that the earth had never fully healed. Patches of scorched grass, stones arranged in a circle, half buried in moss, and in the very middle, a rotted wooden post no taller than my knees, wrapped in blackened twine. Something had happened here. Something old. Something deliberate. I stepped carefully into the circle, the air suddenly heavier, as if I'd entered a room instead of a grove. My skin tingled. My breath felt thick. I pulled the strip of fabric from my coat and without thinking, held it, near the post. The wind picked up sharply, howling once before falling dead again. The trees groaned as if warning me. The map had led me here. But why? I crouched down, brushing away leaves and dirt, until I found something carved into the wood. The spiral, again, smaller but identical. Beneath it, faint letters scratched into the post. Bound once, broken twice. I traced the words with my fingers and felt the heat rise from the wood, as if it remembered fire. I backed away slowly, heart pounding. This wasn't just a sight of memory. It was a seal. And I had disturbed it. Worse, I had brought pieces of it with me. The fabric, the key, the box. All parts of a puzzle someone had tried to hide for good. I turned to leave, but something moved at the edge of the grove. A shadow between trees. Not an animal. Not wind. A figure. Still. Watching. I froze, eyes locked on the dark shape. No face. No sound. Just presence. My hand went to the map, clutching it like a shield. The figure took one step back, melting into the trees. Gone. But the message was clear. I wasn't alone out here. And the path I'd followed hadn't just been marked. For me, it had been baited. I left the grove without looking back. Every step away from it felt like peeling something from my skin, like I was shedding a layer that had already sunk too deep. The woods no longer felt quiet. They felt alert. Branches shifted above me in patterns too purposeful to be natural. The deeper I moved toward the house, the more I felt the weight return to the back of my neck, that familiar pressure of being watched. It wasn't the figure this time. It was the land itself. Back inside, I unrolled the map across the floor and traced the red lines again with shaking fingers. Everything was connected. The lighthouse, the woods, the house, even the inn. The red ink bled into symbols I hadn't seen before, marks that only became visible when the sunlight hit them from a certain angle. One looked like a key, another resembled an eye, and another was simply a spiral drawn over and over until the paper beneath it had nearly torn through. I called the inn, hoping to speak with Mrs. Ellery again, but no one answered. The line just rang, then clicked, then silence. I tried again, this time only static. I stared at the phone and realized I hadn't seen her in days. No lights in the inn, no smoke from the chimney. The village itself seemed to be shrinking, retreating, as if the storm hadn't just shaken the coast but loosened something ancient beneath it. Maybe the others knew. Maybe they were hiding. Or maybe they had already been taken. I sat with the journal again, flipping through its final entries. The last full page read, "The lines weren't drawn to connect. They were drawn to trap." My grandmother had tried to hold it here, to bind it, but the binding had failed. Something had broken free. I closed the journal and stood before the window, staring out toward the sea. The lighthouse was dark again, but I knew now that it didn't need to shine every night. Sometimes, the thing inside it waited in the dark, because it already knew. The way I checked the mirror shard again, still wrapped, still quiet. But when I placed my hand on the drawer, I felt warmth, as if the shard had begun to hum again beneath the cloth, as if it sensed what I had seen, what I had touched. The post in the grove hadn't just been a seal, it had been a warning, and I had brought that warning back with me, into my home, into myself. As the sun lowered behind the clouds, the house grew colder, not from lack of heat, but from something deeper. Like the chill that sinks into stone long after winter has passed, I lit every candle I had, not for light, but for reassurance. Still, the map remained spread across the floor, red lines glowing faintly in the flicker of the flames. I traced the path again, from the grove to the lighthouse, and finally to my house. The lines didn't just connect places, they surrounded them, a circle, a prison, or a summoning ring. A knock came at the door, sharp, deliberate. I froze, hand hovering above the map. It wasn't like the other sounds, not the dripping, not the scraping. This was human, or something very good at pretending. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. Rain had begun to fall again, soft and steady, and standing on the porch, soaked from head to toe, was Mrs. Ellery. I opened the door without thinking. She stepped inside quickly, locking the door behind her. Her face was pale, eyes wide, hands trembling beneath soaked gloves. "They're gone," she whispered. "All of them. The dock's empty. The boats are gone. The inn was marked. I found the spiral burned into the back wall this morning. It's happening again." She looked at me like I was her last lifeline. "You went into the grove, didn't you?" I nodded slowly. She closed her eyes and took a shaky breath. "Then we don't have much time. Once it knows you've seen where it was bound, it stops pretending. The light doesn't warn anymore. It hunts." She looked around the room, gaze landing on the map, the journal, the covered mirror. "You have pieces of it now. That means it'll come through you, unless we finish what she started." I knew who she meant. My grandmother, and whatever plan she'd begun. It had been left to rot in silence. Mrs. Ellery removed something from her coat pocket. A small metal locket, rusted shut. She pressed it into my hand. "You'll need this," she said. "It's the last key." My voice caught. Last key to what? She looked toward the window. The lighthouse was glowing again, dim this time, flickering in the storm like a candle that refused to die. "To the root," she whispered. "And we have to reach it before the storm ends, or the house won't be the only thing that disappears." The storm didn't wait for us. The rain came down in slanted sheets as Mrs. Ellery and I made our way along the cliffside path, following the winding trail that led to the lighthouse. The wind howled like it had a voice, full of rage and warning, tearing at our coats and whipping our hair into our faces. Every step felt heavier than the last, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of what we were walking toward. The air pulsed with an energy I couldn't describe, the kind that makes you feel like you're trespassing on sacred ground. The lighthouse loomed ahead, its silhouette cutting through the sky like a broken needle. Closer now, I could see the way its stones sweated moisture and salt, as though it were breathing. The windows were black, but I knew it was awake. The light hadn't spun since dusk, but I could feel its presence, watching, waiting. We reached the iron gate at the base. It creaked open without resistance, rust flaking off the hinges in soft orange bursts. No one had opened it in years, but someone had kept it oiled. Inside, the air was damp and metallic, thick with the scent of salt, mold, and oil. Our footsteps echoed in the narrow spiral of stone, and every step upward was colder than the last. The stairwell twisted tightly, lined with rusted handrails and bolted panels. And yet, there were signs of life, fresh footprints in the dust, a matchstick still warm near the first landing. Someone had been here recently. Maybe they still were. We found the logbook on a wooden desk in a small chamber halfway up. The room had once been the keeper's quarters. Bed frame rusted through, stove cold for decades, walls lined with peeling paint and water stains. But the logbook was dry, clean, and open. The last entry was dated only 2 weeks ago. Mrs. Ellery, and I exchanged a look before I turned the page. The handwriting was jagged and rushed, the ink pressed too deep into the paper. It read, "She's back, the girl from the bloodline. I saw her in the mirror. The light turned for her." I flipped back through older entries. They spoke of sleepless nights, of whispering storms, of voices in the glass. One line repeated again and again. "The root is not in the stone. The root is in her." Another entry said, "If the light stops, do not breathe. If the mirror speaks, do not listen." My hands trembled as I read, and something inside me began to turn cold. This wasn't just a haunting. This was a cycle, and I was already deep inside it. Mrs. Ellery stood behind me, silent, her hand resting on the back of the chair like she was holding herself in place. "He never left," she whispered. "Not really. The last keeper. He wrote until he couldn't anymore, until it started writing back." I looked up sharply, but her face was blank, eyes locked on the far wall. I turned the pages again. The ink changed midway, darker, thicker, the lines looping unnaturally. The entries no longer followed dates. They followed the storms. One passage read, "The light moves on its own now. The gear is rusted, the bulb shattered. But it turns. It turns when she speaks. It turns when she cries." Another, shorter, "Mirror cracked. Found salt in my mouth. Woke on the floor. No memory." And finally, "It wants the name spoken 3 times. Once to find, twice to bind, thrice to break." My blood turned to ice. I had whispered mine twice, just twice. The edge of that boundary now felt razor thin. A sudden creak above us made both of us jump. Not the sound of the storm outside, but a step, slow, measured, from the level above. I held my breath. Mrs. Ellery reached into her coat and pulled out something wrapped in cloth, a second shard of mirror. "He left this here," she said. "I didn't touch it before. I couldn't. But I think you have to." I unwrapped it slowly. The glass shimmered, warped by time or something worse. It showed no reflection, just mist. The stairs beyond the chamber spiraled upward toward the lantern room. I stepped onto the first step and felt the entire tower groan beneath my feet. It wasn't just age. It was anticipation. The air tightened with every step, and my ears began to ring faintly, like a pressure system collapsing. Halfway up, I paused to look at the shard in my hand. Still mist, but faintly beneath it, I saw something shift. Not behind me, not beside me, beneath me, as though the mirror saw through stone. At the top, the lantern room was dim, the glass around us cracked in jagged webs. Rain had seeped in through every breach. The light apparatus itself was ancient, its lens dusty, its mechanics seized by rust. And yet the moment I stepped inside, the entire mechanism clicked once. then twice, then began to turn. No power, no sound but the wind. Still, the beam flared to life, white, endless, alive, and swept out over the sea as if welcoming me home. The beam passed over the village, over the cliffside, over the ocean, and then, like clockwork, it stopped, right on me. The lens stilled. The light didn't flicker. It held, steady and full, aimed not at the sea, but directly at the lantern room itself. The light wasn't meant to guide ships anymore. It was meant to see, to illuminate what was inside. I stood frozen, feeling exposed, dissected, like something ancient had just opened its eyes after a long sleep, and I was the first thing it saw. Beside me, Mrs. Ellery whispered something I couldn't hear. Her lips moved in a language I didn't recognize, and the mirror shard in my hand grew warm. I looked down. The mist within it had vanished, replaced now by a spiral of light turning inward, slowly, methodically. At the center, a shape began to form. Not a face, but a presence. Something watching from the other side of the glass. I looked up again, and the light passed over us once more. But this time, it didn't keep turning. It stopped. It reversed. The room grew colder. My breath turned visible in the air, and the gear at the base of the light began to move again, this time without rhythm, jerking violently as if something were forcing it backwards. The light flared, then darkened, then flared again, brighter than before. The lighthouse moaned. Not just the walls, but the structure itself. Like something trying to break through the stone from the inside out. Mrs. Ellery gripped the railing tightly. "It's not the keeper," she whispered. "It's what the keeper let in." I stepped forward, raising the mirror shard toward the lens. As I did, the wind shrieked through the cracked windows, and the floor beneath us trembled. I held the glass high. The spiral inside spun faster, and the light from the tower refracted through it, scattering across the chamber in jagged dancing lines. One beam struck the wall, and a symbol appeared, faint, burned into the stone, the same spiral, the same as the post in the grove, the same as the mark on the cloth. It was everywhere. It had always been. In that moment, I understood. The lighthouse wasn't just a tower. It was a conduit. A spine of stone built above something ancient. Something that used light not to warn, but to feed. The beam didn't protect the shore. It searched for the next vessel, and I was no longer outside the circle. I was inside it. The logbook, the journal, the box. They were all breadcrumbs, left not to guide me away, but to lead me in. The spiral on the wall began to glow, faintly, at first, then pulsing with the rhythm of a heartbeat. The glass in the lantern room shook in its frames. The light flared one final time, then collapsed into darkness. The gear stopped. Silence followed, deep and sudden, like the moment between lightning and thunder. And in that stillness, we heard it, a low sound from beneath the floor. Not wind, not water. A voice, ancient and slow, rising through stone, calling, not with words, but with memory. Mrs. Ellery gripped my arm. "It's waking," she said. "The root, the one they built. This over." Her eyes were wide, not with panic, but with resignation. The keeper sealed it once, with mirrors, with light. But time breaks all bindings, and you... Her voice faltered. You're part of the breach. I wanted to deny it, to run, but something inside me had already answered. The storm hadn't brought me here. It had opened the door for me. I had been the key all along. We descended quickly, each step down the spiral stairs shaking underfoot. Dust fell from the ceiling. The wind outside screamed. But beneath it all, the voice continued, calling, humming, twisting inside the marrow of the tower. At the base, the iron door we had entered through was shut, bolted from the inside. But we hadn't done that. I reached for it, but Mrs. Ellery pulled me away. "It won't let you out until it's done with you," she said. "And it's not done yet." In the corner, behind a collapsed wooden bench, we found the entrance. A trap door, half covered in salt and dust. Hidden beneath, a false floorboard. I knelt and placed the blackened key into the old lock, and it turned with a sound like a sigh. Cold air poured upward, wet, heavy, and full of earth. Not the scent of death, but of something older, undisturbed, patient. Mrs. Ellery whispered, "A prayer," then lit the last of our candles. "Whatever's down there," she said, "your grandmother knew it by name, and I think it's been waiting for you to say it." The door creaked open, revealing a narrow stairwell carved into stone. The spiral symbol was etched into every step. As I descended, the air pressed tighter around me, and the flame in my candle bent sideways, drawn forward, not by wind, but by hunger. Behind me, Mrs. Ellery paused at the top and whispered one final warning. "Don't listen to it if it speaks, in your voice." Then the door shut above us, sealing us in, and the dark began to breathe. The air beneath the lighthouse was different, thicker than above, full of moisture and silence, like the breath of something sleeping beneath the earth. The walls were damp stone, carved by hand, the spiral etched deeper into each step as we descended. They began small, crude, but the lower we went, the cleaner the lines became, more precise, symmetrical, as if whoever had carved them had gained purpose, or was guided by something unseen. My candle flickered wildly, even though there was no draft. The staircase finally ended in a small antechamber, its ceiling arched like a chapel. Symbols lined every surface, walls, ceiling, even the floor beneath our feet. In the center stood a stone altar, low and wide, covered in a thin layer of black sand. Atop it lay a mirror, perfectly intact. Not a shard, not a fragment. Whole. I approached it slowly. My reflection was clear, too clear. Like the glass was trying to show not what was, but what was meant to be. Behind me, I saw Mrs. Ellery flinch. She reached for my arm and whispered, "This wasn't here before." Her voice trembled. "I came down with your grandmother years ago. We sealed it with salt and fire. This room was empty." I didn't answer. I couldn't. The mirror was changing. My reflection vanished, replaced by a swirling fog. And in it, I saw the village. But not as it was now. Emptier. Shops boarded, streets cracked. The inn burned to its foundation. I blinked, and the fog shifted again. This time it showed nothing. Just void. like the town had never existed at all. I stepped back from the altar, breathing hard. The candlelight dimmed. Mrs. Ellery moved to the far wall, running her fingers along the carvings. "These weren't made by us," she murmured. "They're older, much older." She paused at one, traced it with her fingertip. "This one means forgetting." I turned toward her, but she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the mirror now, staring into it, and tears were falling down her face. Then she whispered, "My name. It's gone." Her voice cracked. "I can't remember it. I can't." She dropped the candle, and it sputtered out against the wet stone. I rushed to her side, grabbed her shoulders, tried to pull her away from the glass. But she didn't resist. She didn't move at all. Her eyes remained locked on the mirror, and in it, I no longer saw her reflection. Just mine, alone, surrounded by the spiral. I shook her, called her. Nothing. Her eyes were open, but vacant, like a door left swinging after the wind had passed through. Then slowly her body began to change. Not violently, not abruptly, but subtly, like erosion, like memory unraveling. Her hands lost definition. Her hair dimmed to gray. Her clothes became featureless fabric. And then, with a sound like an exhale, she was simply gone. Not dust, not blood, just absence. As if she'd never walked those steps with me. As if I had come alone. The mirror pulsed once, a ripple across its surface like a drop of water in a still pond. My reflection returned, pale, shaking, alone. I backed away, the candle now the only light in the room. I tried to speak her name, but it wouldn't come. I knew she had existed. I remembered her hand in mine, her voice, her warnings, but I couldn't find the name. It was gone, erased from my tongue, from the journal, from the map. As if the Lighthouse had rewritten history, and I was the only one who noticed. I turned to flee, but the staircase behind me had changed. Where before it curved gently upward, now it led straight down, vanishing into darkness I couldn't measure. I shouted, but sound didn't echo. It was swallowed, devoured. I looked at the mirror once more and saw something moving within it. Something walking down the same stairwell I now faced. Not me, not Ellery, something else. And it was getting closer. The spiral lit up again on the altar, glowing with cold white light. The key in my pocket pulsed against my leg. The fabric strip had gone damp, heavy with salt water. I pulled both out and placed them on the stone. The mirror responded immediately, cracks forming along, its edges slow and precise like veins under skin. I didn't know what I was doing. I only knew it had to break. I lifted the candle high and slammed it against the glass. The flame died, but the mirror shattered. And in that moment, I heard her voice again, Ellery, screaming from the broken, shards as if trapped in each splinter. Then the scream was gone, replaced by silence. The real kind. The kind that hurts. I stood in the dark, the last of the candle wax burning my fingers, and understood. This thing didn't kill. It erased. And it had now taken the only person who could have helped me finish what my grandmother started. I stumbled back from the altar, hands shaking, vision blurred by tears and smoke. The mirror was broken, but I didn't feel victorious. The shards still pulsed, faintly, like they were breathing. The stone chamber groaned, not with collapse, but with movement, like a lung drawing in a slow, terrible breath. I turned and ran toward the stairwell. This time it curved upward again. The path had returned, or it had allowed me to believe it had. Either way, I climbed. Each step felt longer than the last, as if the stairs were stretching beneath me. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I kept going. At one point, I looked behind me and saw nothing. No wall, no room, no spiral, just black. I reached into my pocket for the key, needing to feel something real, but it was gone, taken, or left behind. I didn't know anymore. I wasn't sure I remembered what it had looked like. The further I climbed, the more things slipped from me. At the top, the trapdoor was open, but not to the lighthouse. I stepped through and found myself in my grandmother's kitchen. Morning sunlight streamed through the window. The table was set for two. A kettle whistled on the stove. I stood frozen. Everything looked normal, clean, as if none of it had happened, as if the storm hadn't come. The journal was gone. The map, too. Even the mirror on the wall had no crack. Just my reflection, calm and composed, staring back at me. But something was wrong. The reflection blinked before I did, smiled when I didn't. Then slowly it raised its hand, not to wave, not to warn, but to press against the glass from the inside. I stepped back, heart pounding. The mirror shimmered, and the kitchen began to shift. The colors dimmed, the air grew damp, the walls cracked with salt. I wasn't out. I had never left. The lighthouse had shown me a memory, a lure, and now it was closing in around me. I turned and bolted for the front door. It opened onto the cliffs, but not as they were. The village below was gone. Not destroyed, just missing. No roads, no rooftops, no sign it had ever existed. Only the sea, vast and flat, stretching endlessly under a sky that no longer held a sun. The lighthouse behind me groaned, its beam lighting again. And for the first time, I saw where it was pointing. Not at ships, not at the ocean, but at me. I stepped outside, the wind slapping my face with air so thick it tasted like salt and rust. The ground beneath me was solid, but it no longer felt like earth. It pulsed faintly, like a vein running from the lighthouse to my feet. The light swept over me again, pausing briefly, as if scanning, measuring, accepting. I looked down the cliffside once more, hoping to see some trace of the village, anything. But it was gone. The memory had been stripped away, not just from me, but from the world. The journal, the photographs, even my grandmother's letters. No longer in the house. No evidence remained. Just me, the beam, and the knowing. I returned inside, every step echoing louder than it should. The house felt unfamiliar now, like I was trespassing in a place built from fragments of someone else's dream. The pictures on the walls were blank. The clock on the mantel ticked backward. Time itself had begun to erode. In the hallway, the mirror had returned, whole, unbroken. But this time, I didn't see myself. I saw the inside of the lighthouse, the lantern room flickering with firelight and shadows. At the center stood a figure, still, watching, but not alone. Behind it, shapes moved, slow, silent, faceless. I recognized one. The curve of her shoulder, the line of her jaw. Ellery, trapped behind the glass, expression frozen in a mix of grief and silence. Her mouth opened once, then nothing. I pressed, my hand to the surface, cold, unmoving, but I felt it. Her sadness, her warning. The lighthouse hadn't taken her. It had preserved her, like a photograph in salt. It wanted stories, names, legacies, not to destroy, but to hold, to feed. Whispered her name softly, unsure if I could still remember it. And for just a moment, her eyes moved. She saw me. A tear slid down her cheek, and then the mirror went dark. I stepped back into the center of the room as the lighthouse beam passed one last time across the windows. It no longer felt hostile. It felt patient, like it had all the time in the world. And so did I. I now understood what my grandmother had tried to do, and why she had failed. Because you don't fight the lighthouse. You don't run from it. You become part of it. And as the storm returned and the sea began to rise, I spoke my name once more, just once, not to be heard, but to be remembered. The rain came not from the sky, but from the walls. It leaked through the seams of the house like memory breaking loose. Thin rivulets that carried whispers, syllables I couldn't place but somehow knew were names. My name, hers, my grandmother's. Spoken in fragments, layered atop each other until the air grew thick with repetition. The storm had returned, but it wasn't made of thunder or wind. It was made of history, and it had come to collect. I tried to write, to ground myself with ink and paper, but every word I wrote dissolved into water, bleeding across the page like veins. Even my own name refused to stay still, shifting in shape each time I traced it. I watched it blur, not with fear, but with quiet resignation. The lighthouse had taken my past, and now it wanted the rest, the present, the root, the identity. The journal's last page, once blank, now bore a single phrase. You are not the first. You will not be the last. The air vibrated with names. So many of them. Some familiar, some foreign, some not quite human. I heard them in the rustle of the curtains, in the drip of the faucet, in the sigh of the floor beneath my feet. They circled me, a slow chant that grew louder with each breath. Not screams, not cries, just repetition, a summoning. And at the center of it, my name repeated twice, then paused. The third time waited, perched on the edge of the storm, as if daring me to speak it myself. I closed the windows, but the name seeped in anyway. I covered the mirrors, but the glass continued to hum. I even tried silence, absolute, breathless stillness, but it only made the voices clearer. I sat in the hallway, where the spiral had first revealed itself to me and whispered the first name. I could remember that wasn't mine. Ellery. And for a moment, the house stopped breathing. Then the whisper returned, gentler now. Remember her, and she remains. That's when I understood. This wasn't a storm of destruction. It was a storm of erasure. The lighthouse didn't kill. It rewrote. And names were anchors. Memory was the only resistance. If I could hold onto her, onto my grandmother, onto myself, maybe the spiral couldn't complete its turn. Maybe the pattern could be broken. But as I stood, the mirror at the end of the hall uncovered itself. I hadn't touched it. And in the reflection stood the dark figure again. This time, it wore my face. I stepped toward the mirror slowly, the floor beneath me groaning like it no longer agreed with my presence. My reflection blinked, then smiled. Not a warm expression, but one of recognition. It tilted its head, studying me like I was the ghost. Then it spoke, lips moving with perfect synchronization to my breath. But the voice was not mine. It was deeper, layered with echoes, as if the sea itself had learned to speak. "Say it," it whispered. "Say the name. Let the tide come in." I staggered back, but the mirror followed. Not physically, but the reflection shifted, filling the walls, the windows, the surface of spilled water on the floor. Every reflective surface now showed her. Me. It. The house was no longer holding the presence back. It was reflecting it, projecting it. I dropped to my knees, hands over my ears, but the voice now came from inside. Calm, constant, coaxing. "You are almost done. One more name, one more breath." I reached for the mirror shard I had hidden, days ago, still wrapped in the drawer. It burned hot in my hand, and for a moment, I considered hurling it across the room, but instead, I unwrapped it and looked in. The face I saw wasn't mine, but neither was it the figure. It was my grandmother. Her eyes were kind but filled with sorrow. Her lips didn't move, but her gaze spoke clearly. Do not let it finish the third name. And just like that, she faded, replaced once again by mist. I clutched the shard to my chest and began to speak. Not my own name, but hers. My grandmother's full name, syllable by syllable, like a mantra. Then Ellery's, then mine, but only once. I whispered the names of everyone I remembered from the village, even the boatman whose name I never learned. I gave them identity. I gave them place. And the storm inside the house howled in protest, rattling the glass until one of the windows burst, spraying salt and wind across the floor. Books flew from shelves. Flames in the candles stretched sideways. The light from the lighthouse outside flickered violently, unable to complete its rotation. It was struggling now, losing grip. Not because it was weak, but because I had remembered, because I had refused to forget. And in this place, memory was rebellion. The spiral on the floor lit up, pulsing with every name I spoke. Not to summon, not to bind, but to anchor. I dropped to my knees in the center of the spiral, mirror shard pressed to my heart, and kept speaking. My voice cracked, grew hoarse, but I didn't stop. I spoke names I barely remembered. School teachers, neighbors, even the postman who only came once a week. Every syllable became a defiance, every whisper a refusal. And as I spoke, the wind outside faltered, the light from the lighthouse stuttered, and the mirror on the far wall splintered, hairline cracks blooming outward like frost. But the storm wasn't finished. The spiral beneath me flared one final time, bright enough to sear the edges of my vision. A sound followed. Not thunder, not wind, but the unmistakable groan of something ancient being pulled from sleep. The house shuddered. The walls bowed inward. The reflection of myself in every surface flickered rapidly, aging, shifting, dissolving, until finally there was nothing in those reflections at all. Not me. Not her. Just absence. And then the voice returned, singular, calm, closer. It didn't whisper anymore. It breathed. You remember them. But who remembers you? The question struck deeper than any threat. The silence that followed was worse. My thoughts stuttered. My voice faltered. Had I left any trace behind? Would anyone speak my name if I vanished here? Or would I, too, become another reflection, another shadow waiting to be seen and never named? I gritted my teeth and whispered my name again, once. The spiral dimmed, twice. The windows groaned. I paused. That was two. I felt the pressure rise, like a tide behind a dam. One more and the current would break. I clenched my jaw. I didn't say it a third time. Instead, I pressed the shard to the floor, where the spiral met its center, and for the first time, I said her name. The one I'd never dared speak aloud. The one written in the back of the journal in my grandmother's final hand. Thalos. And then the moment the name passed my lips, the house convulsed. Not crumbling, but releasing. The spiral flared once in blinding white, then vanished entirely from the floor. The windows cleared. The mirrors fell silent. The light from the lighthouse extinguished as if exhaling for the last time. And in that breath, the storm stopped. Not just outside, but within. For the first time since I'd returned, there was no whisper, no echo, no call. Just me, alone, remembered. I stayed on the floor for a long time, knees aching, fingers cramping around the mirror shard now dark and lifeless. The spiral was gone, not faded, gone, as if it had never been carved into the floor. I checked the mirror on the wall, cracked, blank, no reflection. Not mine, not hers. The house was still, and for the first time, I could hear the small sounds again. My own breathing, the creak of settling wood, the soft rustle of curtains moving with real wind. I walked through the rooms one by one. The photographs had returned to their frames. The books were back on the shelves, though some had titles I didn't recognize. In the kitchen, the kettle whistled faintly, though I hadn't turned on the stove. Time, it seemed, had unraveled and rewound, but not perfectly. There were gaps, moments of déjà vu in the placement of objects, names missing from the covers of letters, as if the house remembered most of what it was, but not all. Outside, the sky was gray but calm. The lighthouse stood motionless, dark, its glass lens cracked in two. I approached it slowly, half expecting the beam to reignite, the voice to return. But it didn't. At the door, I found a single object resting on the step. A locket. Mrs. Ellery's. I picked it up and held it tight, whispering her name again and again until the silence felt full instead of empty. I didn't know where she had gone, but she hadn't been forgotten. And in this place, that was everything. I returned to the house and placed the locket beside the journal, now closed and sealed with red ribbon. I didn't open it again. Some stories aren't meant to be finished. They're meant to be remembered. I covered the mirror one last time, not out of fear, but respect. It had shown me the shape of things, of loss, of memory, of how the things we forget become hungry, and how only a name, spoken with care, can hold them at bay. That night, I dreamed of the ocean, calm and wide. The lighthouse was gone, not broken, not ruined, simply not there. And in its place stood a figure, neither shadow nor light, watching the horizon. It didn't speak. It didn't move. But it held the silence like a promise. And I knew, deep in my bones, that the name had not been destroyed, only fed. And one day, when silence grows, long again and memory grows thin, it will begin to whisper once more. The days that followed passed strangely, not quickly, not slowly, just sideways. The world outside resumed its rhythm. Tides rolled in, gulls returned to the cliffs, and the village began to breathe again. People walked the streets, though fewer than I remembered. They nodded when they passed me, but no one spoke first, as if they weren't sure whether I was part of their world anymore, or something the storm had left behind. I tried to ask about the inn, about Mrs. Ellery, but no one seemed to know who I meant. One man even asked if I was referring to the bookstore that had burned years ago. There had never been an inn, he said. I thanked him and walked away, heart sinking. Names held power here, and hers had slipped. But not from me. Every morning I whispered it to the locket. Every night I placed it under my pillow. And though her voice never returned, the silence grew softer, less empty. I visited the lighthouse again. Once. The door was gone, bricked up, seamless, as if no one had ever stepped inside. But I knew better. The cracks in the foundation were still there, spidering outward like veins. The ground felt hollow beneath my feet, a quiet reminder that what lies beneath is never truly sealed. I didn't knock. I didn't speak. I only laid a small shell at the base of the stone and whispered the final entry from the journal. Names anchor. Silence feeds. That night, the beam lit once more. Just once. A single arc across the sea. Not white, but gold. Not searching, but remembering. I watched it from my window, hand on the glass, and when it passed over the house, I felt warmth. Not cold. Not dread. And in the reflection, I didn't see her, or me, or anyone. Just light. And that, I thought, was enough. Still, I keep the mirror covered. Not out of fear, but caution. I speak names out loud. I tell stories. I leave offerings by the shore. And I never say my name more than once in a single breath. Some rules were written in stone, others in salt. But the ones that matter live in memory. And memory, I've learned, is the last kind of magic the sea has no power to wash away. The villagers began to change, slowly. They remembered things they hadn't before. Names of relatives long buried. Faces of those who had vanished in storms past. One woman placed flowers beside the collapsed stone well behind her cottage and said, "For my sister," though she swore she never had one. A boy brought me a drawing of the lighthouse, though his parents insisted he'd never seen it lit. Whatever had been unspoken was surfacing, like driftwood after a tide. The spiral never returned. Not on the walls, not on the floor, but I dreamt of it often, drawn not in ink or blood, but in sound. a low hum beneath the waves, a rhythm that only made sense when you stopped listening and started remembering. I stopped fearing it. I began to respect it. There was power in forgetting, I realized, but far more in choosing what to remember, and when. I started writing again. Not the journal. That stayed sealed. But new pages. My pages. Stories of this place, of the names I could still recall, of the ones I feared were slipping. I didn't write for others. I wrote for the cracks, for the shadows that still lingered in the corners at night, for the mirror that sometimes trembled under the cloth. And sometimes, I swear, when the rain begins to fall just right, I hear Ellery's voice humming along the rooftop, keeping time with mine. I planted herbs in the window box where the salt used to collect. Lavender, rosemary, names with roots. One morning, I found a spiral traced into the soil with a stone. Not deep, not threatening, just left. A mark. I left it alone. Let it fade naturally. These are not signs to erase, I've learned. They're invitations to remember and to choose how you live beside them. The sea doesn't stop rising, but we can build stories strong enough to float. At sunset, I walk the cliffs. The wind carries the scent of brine and something sweeter I can't name. The lighthouse stays dark, but some nights I feel its gaze. Not harsh, not cold, just aware. And I nod to it, like to an old neighbor. Not quite a friend, but no longer a stranger. We've made a kind of peace, I think. Or maybe just a promise. I won't forget it, and in return, it won't take what I'm not ready to give. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd said my name a third time, if I'd given in to the pull of the mirror, or followed the voice down the spiral to where memory goes to drown. But then I see the sunrise burn gold across the sea, and I remember that even curses can be undone, not with fire or salt, but with remembrance. I'm not the keeper of the light. I'm the keeper of its story. And maybe that's more important. The villagers have stopped asking where I came from. They greet me with quiet nods and pass baskets of fruit or folded letters to leave on my doorstep. I open some. Others I bury beneath the roots of the oldest tree near the shore. Names I've found, like seeds, grow stronger when planted with care. Even if no one else remembers who they belong to, the earth does. The sea does. And sometimes, I think, the lighthouse does too. A girl came to my door last week. She couldn't have been older than 10. She asked if the house was haunted. I told her no. She asked if it had always been mine. I said, not always, but now it remembers me. She smiled and said she could hear the wind say her name sometimes. I didn't warn her. I only asked what she did when it spoke. She answered, I talk back. I smiled. That's good, I said. Just don't forget who you are when you do. That night, I stood outside with the locket in my hand and the wind at my back. I whispered her name again, Ellery, and felt the ground hum beneath me. A soft acknowledgement. Not grief, not hunger, just presence. And I knew then, some disappearances aren't endings. They're exchanges. Pieces of ourselves we lend to the world so it can hold them when we no longer can. Not loss, not erasure. A kind of transformation. The mirror still waits in the hall, covered, quiet. I don't fear it now. It's not a trap. It's a door. And doors, I've learned, don't just open one way. If one day I feel the light pass over me again, or the whisper call my name a third time, I'll be ready, not with resistance, but with memory, with stories, with names. And maybe that's all the Lighthouse ever wanted, not to consume us, but to be remembered by us before the dark. I walk the cliffs most evenings now, when the sky begins to turn and the tide hums low like a lullaby. I speak to no one, but I speak. Names, mostly. Sometimes stories. Sometimes only silence. I let the sea carry the sound as far as it's willing. I think that's how the Lighthouse listens now. Not through mirrors or light, but through wind. Through the breath between words. Through the weight we give to remembering. The town still changes. New faces arrive, and sometimes old ones vanish. But the houses remain. The stones remain. And the sea remembers, even when we don't. I've learned not to fear the missing pieces. Some gaps are meant to stay open. They let the light in. They let the names echo a little longer before fading. And if you listen closely on the right kind of night, you'll hear them. Not as ghosts, but as gratitude. I don't know how long I'll stay here. Maybe forever. Maybe just until someone else finds their way to the door, mirror-covered, journal-bound, drawn by dreams they can't explain. When that happens, I'll leave the key beneath the stone, where I once found the map, and I'll write their name beside mine. Not to bind them, but to remember them, in case they forget themselves along the way. The lighthouse hasn't lit again since that night. But that's all right. Some lights are meant to rest. Others burn quietly, unseen, in the hearts of those who carry their stories forward. And I've made peace with being one of them. I've stopped trying to seal the door, or silence the wind. I've learned to listen without fear, to speak without invitation, and to remember without needing to be remembered in return. When the fog returns and the cliffs vanish into mist, I don't close the curtains. I watch, and I wait. And sometimes, when the storm curls over the sea like a hand pulling the past into the present, I whisper into the dark, I remember you. And the dark, in its endless hush, whispers back, so do I. At the world's edge where the land gives way, a lighthouse sleeps with its eyes shut tight. No flame above, no mirror to sway, just bones of silence and echoes of light. Forgotten names whisper over the sea, weaving lost memories through curtains of mist. The wind knows what time lets be, and sings to the ones who choose to exist. She walks the paths that others avoid, with steps that remember, quiet and deep. She carries old stories in the sound of her voice, and a name on her chest the wind swore to keep. The sea has taken all it could claim, but she's planted what must remain. And where there is silence, there is a vow. To remember is to keep the dark out. If ever the light begins to turn, and the mirror calls with grace or fear, let someone answer, strong and stern, I came to remember, not disappear.